In Hegel's analysis, to the degree that terror is the result not of the objective situation, but of an ideology, then it's primarily the responsibility of anarchistic millenarianism and abstract universalism that, in their flight from any particular or determined elements, are only able to express themselves through their rush to erase. With regard to the Bolshevik Revolution, one must not lose sight of the permanent state of emergency provoked by imperialist intervention and siege. Yet the most properly ideological component of the terror relates to the cult of universality and abstract utopia, which hinders the action of the new leadership group and ends up provoking its division. It's interesting to see the way Trotsky, in the middle of the 1930s, casts aside his wise critiques of Kollontai and mocks Stalin's rehabilitation of the family, since the state had been entrusted with the education of the younger generation, political power, far from concerning itself with supporting the authority of those who are older, the father and mother in particular, has instead concentrated in separating the children in order to isolate them from old customs. Also, done openly in the period of the first five-year plan, schools and the communist youth had frequently appealed to children with the aim of denouncing the drunk father and the religious mother, in order to shame them and to attempt to re-educate them. It's another matter to note what success. In any case, this method has shaken family authority itself on 366 in participating in the spread of the old customs, and therefore of the ideology and particularism of the old regime. The family is identified as one of the obstacles that the forward march of universality is called upon to strike at or topple. The denunciation of family authority causes not a reduction of violence, but an increase of it. The condemnation of the Constitution and of law as instruments of bourgeois domination has the same result. Working from these conclusions, it becomes impossible to put form to and even think of a socialist state and law. Naturally, there's a contradiction between the reverence to the ideal of the withering away of the state and the appeal to the state to intervene as well in the sphere of family relations. But it's a contradiction that invariably manifests itself in the anarchistic rhetoric of abstract universalism and the violent practices it ends up encouraging. At this moment, we are obligated to raise another consideration. This tendency, to see the particularities themselves as a disruptive element that contaminates the universal, manifests itself far beyond the Bolshevik leadership group. We can think of the distrust or the hostility with which Rosa Luxemburg generally viewed nationalist movements, whose neglect of the international cause of the proletariat is denounced. After the October Revolution, the great revolutionary, on the one hand, criticizes the Bolsheviks for their lack of respect for democracy and its liquidation, yet on the other hand, she encourages them to crush with an iron fist any nationalist tendencies arising from the peoples without history, rotten corpses that arise from their secular graves. 367 And now let's see how Stalin describes the effects of the socialist revolution on the national question, shaking the lowest stratum of humanity and driving them into the political scene. It brings new life to a whole series of new nationalities, previously unknown or poorly known. Who could have thought that the old Tsarist Russia represented nothing less than 50 nations and national groups? However, the October Revolution, in breaking the old chains and putting on stage a whole series of nationalities and forgotten peoples, gave them a new life and new development. 368 We now reach a paradoxical conclusion, at least from the point of view of the usual historical evaluations and the ideological stereotypes dominant nowadays. In relation to the peoples who emerge from their secular graves, according to Luxemburg's wording, or the forgotten peoples, according to Stalin's wording, it's the first who reveals a much more threatening and repressive attitude. Naturally, with regards to the judgment on those who actually wielded power, it's a matter of seeing if, and up to what point, praxis corresponded to theory. It remains true that Luxemburg's abstract universalism is shown to be potentially more loaded with violence, for in the course of her evolution she has tended to read national demands as a deviation from the real path of internationalism and universalism. We will reach a similar conclusion, again on the topic of the national question, If this time we compare Stalin and Trotsky against the theory formulated by the German Social Democratic leader, on the basis of which, with the victory of socialism in a country or group of countries, and even just with the development of bourgeois democratic society, national differences and particularities would disappear, or tend to disappear. The former objects, such a vision, that superficially ignores the stability of nations, ends up opening the door to a war against national cultures, national minorities, oppressed peoples, and to a policy of assimilation and colonization, to a policy desired, for example, by the Germanizers and Russifiers of Poland. 369 In this case as well, it is a universalism unable to accept the particular that encourages violence and oppression. Still, in the context of comparing different theories, this abstract universalism is closer to Trotsky than to Stalin. Similar to the German Social Democratic leader, Luxemburg also strongly criticizes the Bolsheviks for their petty bourgeois agrarian reform, which conceded land to the peasantry. To this outlook, one can counterpose Bukharin, according to whom, in the conditions of Russia at that time, with a monopoly on political power solidly in the hands of the Bolsheviks, it is precisely private interests and the drive of the peasantry and others to enrich themselves that could contribute to the development of the productive forces and, in the last analysis, to the cause of socialism and communism. 370 A significant transformation occurred with Bukharin. If during Brest-Litovsk, with regard to the national question, he had shown an abstract universalism, here in relation to NEP and the agrarian question, the process of building universality must also advance through the opportune utilization of particular interests. We are witnessing a learning process and self-critical reflection of extraordinary interest, and that helps us understand what has happened in countries like China and Vietnam in our time. Bukharin goes on, quote, "We imagine things in the following form: we take power, we take nearly everything into our grasp, we immediately put into motion a planned economy, it doesn't matter if difficulties arise, some we eliminate, others we overcome, and the whole thing has a happy ending. Today we clearly see that the question is not solved this way." Unquote. The aspiration to organize production coercively, by way of orders, leads to catastrophe. In overcoming the caricature of socialism, communists are obligated by experience to take into account the enormous importance of private individual incentive with the development of the productive forces in mind, and of course a development of the productive forces that leads us to socialism and not to a full restoration of a so-called healthy capitalism. 371 To protest, however, like Trotsky and the opposition would do, against the degeneration of Soviet Russia due to the persistence of the private economy in the rural areas and of a class collaboration by communists with the peasantry, and with the bourgeois strata tolerated under NEP, would have led to the end of civil peace and an enormous St. Bartholomew's Night. 372 Was Bukharin's defeat crucial only because of the need to accelerate the country's industrialization as much as possible in preparation for war? Or did the stubborn hostility to all forms of private property and the market economy also contribute to it? It's a question that we will deal with later. For now, we can have one point of reference: the concentrationary universe reaches its peak during the forced collectivization of agriculture, and with an iron fist treatment of bourgeois and petty bourgeois tendencies within the peasantry, generally members of the peoples without history, to use the unfortunate language that Luxemburg borrowed from Engels. Aside from the brutality of this or that political leader, there can be no doubt about the fatal role played by a universalism incapable of integrating and respecting the particular. The pages that we've used from Hegel 373 are like a refutation in advance of the explanation of Stalinism contained in the so-called Secret Report of 1956. Presented at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It would be, of course, dishonest to pretend that Khrushchev was at Hegel's level, but it's curious that the tragedy and the horror of Soviet Russia continued to be the responsibility of a single figure, in fact, of a single scapegoat, as if the extraordinary analysis that the phenomenology of spirit dedicates to absolute liberty and the terror had never existed.